Okay, students, we're going to begin. This is the third and final section, which should take us to the end of chapter 12. And we're going to begin by talking about the significance of the Supreme Court rulings in addition to Marbury versus Madison, which we've already talked about, that was made by the Supreme Court during the chief judgeship of John Marshall. The next important case that we need to talk about is the Supreme Court case of McCulloch versus Maryland. This has to do with the national bank, national power, the view of the Constitution, should it be strictly interpreted, loosely interpreted, so a bunch of issues that we've already talked about in the past. But some of this is the result of the Panic of 1819, so you may want to go back and take a glance at that. But here's what was happening in regard to the background of McCulloch versus Maryland. Maryland had a branch of the National Bank that was stationed in it in Baltimore. And Maryland basically wanted to charge the National Bank for doing business in its state. I think it was going to put a tax on the paper that the money was going to be printed on. The president of that bank was a guy by the name of James McCulloch. He was the cashier or the leader of that particular branch of the bank, and he refused to do that. So he refused to pay that tax. So Maryland sued him, and it reached the Supreme Court. So that's why it's called McCulloch versus Maryland. So Chief Justice John Marshall, in that decision, ruled that a state, in this case Maryland, so notice it's state power versus federal power, that a state, Maryland, could not tax the federal government. The power to tax, he said, and the court said, was given in the Constitution to the national or the central government and was not a state power. He also said, and this is kind of the key line that came out of it, is that the power to tax includes the power to destroy. In other words, a state cannot have that type of power of the federal government, because if you continue to pass a tax that's higher and higher and higher, you can destroy something. So if you give a state the power to tax, in essence, the bank, a branch of the national government, then you can tax it out of existence. So notice that in doing this, the case is asserting the national government's authority over the states. That's significant. And also this statement, if you're kind of catching it, is certainly supporting Hamilton's view as opposed to Jefferson's view of the Constitution. Hamilton's view of loose construction, the elastic clause. Congress or the government can do whatever is not prohibited by the court. So in this decision, McCulloch versus Maryland, that's what the court is deciding. If you want to download the video on McCulloch versus Maryland, you probably have to download the Chapter 12 video to get it. If you feel like you need to do that, certainly do so. Don't want to talk about these other cases in a whole lot of detail, but I do just kind of want to point out these other Supreme Court cases made by the Marshall Court, all of which do the following. They increase the Supreme Court and thus the national government's power over states and insert just an increasing function or role of the federal government. So just look at some of those. There's the Supreme Court case of Cohens versus Virginia. And in that case, the Supreme Court ruled, as you can see here, the Supreme Court ruled that the court could overrule a state Supreme Court. So you see that the U.S. Supreme Court is stating its superiority to state Supreme Courts. In a case which was called Gibbons versus Ogden, in that case, the U.S. government said via the Supreme Court that the government could control interstate commerce and waterways. So in this sense, you see that the government is stating the federal government, that we have the power to control commerce in interstate waterways. More power for the central government now to regulate commerce, not a power that is given to the states. In Fletcher versus Peck, the U.S. Supreme Court said that it could strike down state laws and uphold property rights. You can find out more detail on any of these cases if you feel the need to do so. You'll see the overall point of this. In Dartmouth versus Woodward, had to do with the original charter of Dartmouth that now was changed, and in that case the Supreme Court said that business was protected from state governments. The state government couldn't make Dartmouth College essentially change its original charter. The bottom line point of all of this in regard to these cases that I just want to underline for you is that in each of these cases it's showing the superiority of the national government over the states. It's showing that the government has authority in areas like commerce, business contracts, etc. So the central government is being viewed as supreme by Marshall's court. So pretty important stuff. Y'all will learn more about that, I would imagine, in government next year. Let's move on as we're dealing with this with some other foreign policy things that took place during Monroe's presidency. Again, all of this, as we come to a conclusion in this chapter, is dealing with those years of Monroe's presidencies. One of those is when we negotiated a treaty with Great Britain. That treaty, as you can see, ended up being known as the Rush-Bagot Agreement. In that treaty, you'll see it on a map in just a second. In that treaty, as you can see, the U.S. and Britain agreed that they would share control of the Oregon Territory for 10 years, and perhaps most importantly, it set the northern boundary of the United States. It simply extended it from where it already was, the 49th parallel, all the way to the edge of the Louisiana Territory. Later, that 49th parallel is going to be extended all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The U.S. ceded everything above that line to Britain. Great Britain ceded everything below that line to the United States. So there it is. There's the 49th parallel, fixed boundary between British Canada and the United States. Not at this time, but later that boundary is going to be extended all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So that is the so-called Rush-Bagot Agreement. I want to mention, as we think about that the key, Monroe's president, but the key figure in his cabinet is his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. Notice as a pattern, you can trace through it, that certainly there were a couple of vice presidents that became president, but being Secretary of State, as you're noticing, was the key step in becoming president. Thomas Jefferson had been a Secretary of State. His Secretary of State, James Monroe, became president. Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, is going to become president, etc. So that position of Secretary of State, pretty important. And also, just going back, I'll get back to the foreign policy stuff in a second, so sorry for going backwards. But when we talk about the Supreme Court decisions of the Marshall Court, another name that needs to be thrown into the mix is that in Congress, a senator named Daniel Webster, he is from Massachusetts, he becomes kind of the symbol of a strong central government in Congress. So he's kind of the mirror of John Marshall at the judicial branch. Daniel Webster, who we'll talk about more later, is kind of the key figure in the legislative branch. Now, after that brief diversion, back to some foreign policy stuff that was taking place. At this case, we need to reintroduce ourselves to one Andrew Jackson, hero of the Battle of New Orleans, hero of the War of 1812. Here's the situation where he fits in at this point in the story. After the War of 1812, Spain controlled Florida, But if you ask the United States' opinion at the time, they were not doing a terribly good job of controlling Florida. They had pulled out a lot of their troops and weren't patrolling it very well. So, what happened in Spanish-controlled Florida is that Seminole Indians, the northern part of Florida is where the Seminole Indians were. Think of Florida State Seminoles, located in Tallahassee. That's their mascot. One of their last chiefs, Osceola, is kind of the guy who you see run out on the football field with the flag at the beginning of Florida State games. Seminole Indians used Florida as a base of operation to launch attacks into the southern part of the U.S. Slaves from the southern United States could escape easily into essentially another nation, Spanish-controlled Florida, by going across the Florida border. Outlaws used that area as a haven in Florida and could cross the border and do different raids, etc. So President Monroe sent Andrew Jackson to the border to kind of patrol and take care of that area. Speculation on exactly what the orders were, but at the end of the day, Jackson you can probably maybe drop the probably, went far beyond what his orders were, which were to patrol the borders. He kind of goes nuts, but he's extremely successful. He crosses the border into Georgia. He ransacks, destroys a couple of Seminole villages. He hanged a couple of Seminole Indian chiefs. He captured Pensacola. He drove the Spanish governor out. He is going above and beyond his orders, but he is successful. This shows you, if you track this blue line, this was the whole Battle of New Orleans stuff that we already talked about. This shows you what he did in his 1818 raid down into Florida. Again, supposed to be patrolling the border, but invades Florida, ransacks Seminole Indians, captures Pensacola, etc., drives out the Spanish. Renegade, but a successful renegade. So, as a result of that, there was a question. What is President Monroe going to do with the general who has kind of gone rogue, but has been successful? And you got to think in terms of overall, not just U.S. history, but history context. Throughout the course of history, rogue generals can sometimes decide that they want to take over a government and be the ruler of it. So some fear of that with Andrew Jackson. So President Monroe asked his cabinet, what do I need to do with Andrew Jackson? He kind of went above and beyond these orders, but he was successful. He got some different opinions. Most of his cabinet, primarily including a man by the name of John C. Calhoun, very important. We'll talk more about him later. He was from South Carolina, a member of Monroe's cabinet. He told Monroe that Jackson's a dangerous man. You better shut him down. You need to censor him. You need to clip his wings. Do something to kind of keep him in check, maybe even reprimand him, etc. Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, said, don't do anything about it. He was successful, let it roll. Quincy Adams said, leave him alone, and that's what Monroe decided to do. John Quincy Adams said, here's what's going to happen. The Spanish are going to pitch a little bit of a fit. Just listen to it. Don't worry about it. Then they're going to realize that they need to negotiate, and their control of Florida has run its course, and they need to sell Florida and do the best that they can to the United States. That's exactly what Monroe did. The result of that is what is called the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1818. In that treaty, Spain, here's the big thing, Spain turned over western Florida along with eastern Florida. In other words, all of Florida. There were just some different chunks on it. You'll see it on a map in a second. Spain, they really didn't have much claims in Oregon, but they gave up any claims that they had in the Oregon Territory, which we'll talk more about in future chapters. And they agreed on a western boundary, the boundary of the Louisiana Territory with Spanish territory. The United States agreed to pay $5 million and gave up some of their territorial claims in Texas, which is going to become a whole bigger deal in the future. That is called the Adams-Onis Treaty, or sometimes just the Treaty of 1818. So that's what it did. So notice now in 1819, boom, finally, Florida has become a part of the United States because of what Andrew Jackson did and Monroe waiting it out, etc. The western boundary of the Louisiana Territory, or the U.S., with Spanish possessions was set by this treaty. So pretty important foreign policy stuff that happens during his presidency. This map just kind of summarizes both of those treaties, Rush-Bagot and the Adams-Onis Treaty. Finally, in regard to his foreign policy, Monroe's foreign policy, probably the chief part of it, is what is called the Monroe Doctrine. And here's the background to that. During those wars that were going on in Europe, when they come to an end, Spain's Central and South American colonies had won their independence during that time period. Now the wars are over. Some concern that Spain might move back in and try to reconquer some of these new independent countries. Britain wanted the United States to enter into some sort of joint declaration that they didn't want that to happen. Monroe, because John Quincy Adams, who's really the brains in his presidency, told him, we don't need to do that. Britain's trying to hedge us in by issuing this joint agreement. We need to issue just a separate statement from our own, and Britain's going to prevent other countries from moving into this area anyway. But if we do a joint agreement with Britain, Britain's going to move in. So again, John Quincy Adams, you may not be able to follow all of that, but being pretty crafty, seeing all sides of this, and said, don't issue a statement with them about European countries in South and Central America. Let's issue one of our own. There was also concern about the Russians, but think of the world map, moving down along the west coast from Alaska, which they already controlled, down into California. So you had that as a factor as well, which leads to the chief piece of Monroe's foreign policy, which of course is the Monroe Doctrine. In that doctrine, which again you can download and run off those videos and look at them if you want to, but basically, and you can read from the PowerPoint if you want to, I'm not going to read all this to you, but in the Monroe Doctrine, who John Quincy Adams was really instrumental in that, here's what it boils down to. The U.S. declared the Americas essentially off limits to Europe. The U.S. was going to recognize any European colonies that were already there, but Europe, do not come over here and try to overthrow any of these new independent republics that have been created. Leave them alone. Hands off in the Western Hemisphere. In return, the U.S. said, and this becomes a piece of our idea of being neutral and not getting involved in European affairs. It dates back to the Monroe Doctrine in part, where in return to Europe, you stay out of the Western Hemisphere. The United States also pledged that they would not meddle or get involved in events in the Eastern Hemisphere, in Europe, essentially, is what I should say. So the U.S. will protect America's new countries that have been created in South and Central America, which had been formed in this areas, and no new European colonization in the New World. So basically, European countries, you stay in Europe, don't try to mess with European affairs. That's our domain. Don't mess with these new independent countries that have broken away from Spain, and we will likewise stay out of European affairs. That is kind of summarized. If you want to kind of pull up the PowerPoint or just stare at this screen, kind of summarized with this graphic here, which kind of breaks it down into some subpoints, but I've essentially told you what the Monroe Doctrine did. So that pretty much wraps it up, folks, for this chapter. Very good.